Today we will be doing lesson 1.2, Native Americans before European contact. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain how and why various native populations in the period before European contact interacted with the natural environment in North America. Environment is going to be very important in this lesson as it's going to be the primary factor that shapes the development of indigenous or native cultures. We will start off first looking at the importance of maize culture. Maize is a form of corn that we have as part of our everyday diets here in the United States. Originally a wild form of corn that grew in Mexico, central to southern Mexico, maize became the primary staple crop for most Native American cultures. As those cultures learned how to use agriculture to collect seeds from maize and plant it, they could control the crop rather than relying on it sporadically being found as a food supply. With the advent of agriculture, specifically with maize, corn was traded from Mexico north and south. The trade routes we're concerned with are those that went into northern Mexico and crossed into what is today the contemporary United States. Maize permeated the southwestern United States, Arizona, and New Mexico, and followed natural occurring trade routes along rivers into the central and even eastern parts of the modern United States. Once cultures encountered maize and learned how to grow maize, it had a substantial impact on the development of native cultures. First of all, maize became a serious part of their economic development. It became a trade commodity that was exchanged between cultures, thus becoming an item of barter or trade. Second, when cultures no longer had to follow animals for their food supply, it allowed them to settle in one location. And when they planted maize crops, which did require them to tend those crops, communities began to stay in one place rather than following a nomadic pattern. Third, advanced irrigation was developed. Because maize is a crop that requires regular and substantial watering, native cultures had to use the technology that they developed in order to divert water to their maize crops so they could grow fields further away from naturally occurring supplies such as rivers or streams. And finally, social diversification among societies occurred. As communities grew more adept at growing maize, fewer and fewer farmers were needed to tend the crops, leaving other people with more free time on their hands. And what we see is the development of social classes, with a lower class of farmers and then a middle class, usually of artisans, who made tools and goods that were exchanged within the community. And then finally, an elite class emerged that usually consisted of a ruling class, often intertwined with religious leaders who controlled the mythology of the community, which was often closely tied to the planting of maize, as many Native American cultures used weather and the natural environment as part of their culture. Second, we will look at the development of Native American cultures across the United States. We will generally divide these cultures into the central U.S., the eastern U.S., and the western U.S. So we will begin first with the central cultures of the Great Basin and Great Plains. The Great Basin is in the southwest United States. It extends from modern-day Arizona and New Mexico up into Nevada and Southern California. It is a hot, dry environment with much of the Great Basin as a desert environment with very little naturally occurring water. When maize first entered that culture, native people such as the Anasazi, who were later called the Pueblo, adapted to maize culture and used advanced irrigation techniques to build large communities in the American Southwest and Southern California. However, around 1300, that sedentary or stay put culture slowly began to crumble as the region experienced a prolonged drought. Without rain to use in their irrigation systems, the sedentary cultures of the Southwest became nomadic, and the people of the Anasazi and Pueblo became the nomadic people of the Arapaho, the Navajo of that area today. The Great Plains is another part of the central United States. It extends roughly west of the Mississippi River and east of the Rocky Mountains. It includes the low flat states like the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, down into Texas. Its environment is one of rapid environmental change. The further north you go, once you get into the Dakotas and Minnesota, it becomes much colder and longer throughout the year. It's a more mountainous terrain. The central United States is more temperate, but it fluctuates between heat and cold. And then as you get further in the south, in areas like Oklahoma and Texas, it's a warmer, drier environment. As a result, animals on the Great Plains tend to be more migratory than in other parts of the United States, moving from north to south as the climate and weather changed yearly. These nomadic cultures, such as Bison, provided a food supply for Great Plains peoples. So they did not develop maize culture in the way that other regions of the country would, having a readily ample food supply in the form of bison and other large herd animals. The Great Plains people remained nomadic, having established hunting territories across the central United States, which provided enough food for them to subsist on as a largely mobile culture. In the eastern United States, maize culture took root. The eastern United States culture extends up in the northeast in what we would call New England and New York, down along the Mississippi River, including the area of southern Illinois and central Missouri, and in the Atlantic seaboard down by the Carolinas and Florida. It's a temperate environment where there are weather changes, but not as extreme on the Great Plains. The people in the eastern United States adapted maize culture and sedentary life in the construction of villages and communities. They also used hunter-gatherer techniques in which people from the community would go out and seek food, whether it be plant-based food or animal food, to supplement what they grew agriculturally. As a result, the Eastern cultures developed permanent complex villages along the eastern seaboard and throughout the central and southeastern United States, the largest of which was the Cahokia community in southwestern Illinois. The central city of Cahokia, at its peak, eclipsed the population of the city of London at the same time. So these are large-scale, complex cultures with large populations that subsisted both on agriculture and hunting and gathering of animals and other foodstuffs. Finally, the Western cultures of the United States include the Pacific Northwest, states like Oregon and Washington, and down into Northern California. These are temperate, rainy climates. They don't have seasons as much as the rest of the United States does, but they are very wet, especially the further north you go into the Pacific Northwest states. Because there was an ample food supply that came from rivers and streams in the form of fish and salmon along the coast, these are a primarily hunter-gatherer culture. They did very little planting, very little agriculture because there was no need to. But unlike the other hunter cultures in the Great Plains of the United States, the Northwest Indian people remained in permanent communities because unlike bison and other herd animals, fish don't move from place to place. The streams always provided a ready supply of food, so they could construct permanent villages like the Eastern people while relying on hunting like the Great Plains and Central United States people could. And that is an overview of the three cultures of the United States, to which we will return to our primary question for this lesson. Can you now explain how and why various Native American populations in the period before European contact interacted with the natural environment of North America?